Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the north where the Ukrainians have recaptured some territory northeast of Lipsy. This is in the outskirts of the town. This happens as a result of the Russians pressing on to Lipsy, but with the additional Ukrainian reinforcements arriving in the area, it made it difficult for the Russians to continue pressuring the town to gain a foothold. Instead, they were forced to withdraw to fortified positions beyond that of the town of Lipsy, and the Ukrainians are now continuously counterattacking to recapture these positions and push the Russians away. The Ukrainians here have an advantage, which is the elevation that they have with the town of Lipsy, as well as the additional manpower that has arrived, allows the Ukrainians to outnumber the Russians 3-1. In turn, the Russian advantage that they have available that allows them to hold the line as much as possible is the firepower advantage they have in the area. Further east in the direction of Vovchansk, the Russians have flanked the Ukrainian positions in the northern part of the Vovchansk river line, where they've managed to reach the bridge here in between the two sides. This means that the Russians have cut off and encircled the Ukrainian soldiers in the north. The main Ukrainian positions in the north is around these high-rise apartment complexes in the northern bank of the Vovchansk river, where we see this video here which shows heavy Russian airstrikes on these positions. The Ukrainian positions here are fortified positions within these apartment complexes that have been prepared for quite a while. The Russians are simply heavily bombarding those positions to prevent the Ukrainians from making use of these fortified positions. Instead, they are flanking their positions, cutting off their supply line, and leaving them in this pocket where they're now being heavily bombarded around the clock. Therefore, we see that despite there is a significant amount of Ukrainian soldiers here in this section of the front line, they are being heavily bombarded, and the Russians are able to hold their positions in the northern bank, as Ukrainians are not able to conduct any successful river crossings. Instead, they had the one bridge that was never blown, which has been physically captured by the Russians, which indicates that it's likely going to be blown as well to prevent the Russians from crossing over to the southern parts. And instead, we see that the main fighting is taking place here in the northern parts, where the Russians are heavily bombarding the Ukrainian positions. At the same time, there are reports that the grouping of Russian forces here in the north are going to be entering into northern Kharkiv within the next few days. I'm not sure if that is accurate, but it is likely going to be here in the direction of Zaporizhzhia that the direction will be opened towards, with the Russian gathering of troops here northwest of Kharkiv near the Sumy border, instead of going into the Sumy region. I also discussed with my Russian sources about the grouping of 200 to 300,000 Russian soldiers that the Ukrainian Minister of Defense was talking about, and it turns out that either he's straight out lying or that he's counting the conscripts, because there is no such gathering of Russian troops in the north. Instead, at most, the Russian troops in the north number around 100,000. That means that there's no possibility of a massive offensive happening within the next few weeks, as the Russians have not gathered that many troops. Instead, we will likely see more incursions of Russian troops entering across the front line, similar to what they have done in northern and northeastern Kharkiv, where they simply plan on expanding the front line rather than launching offensive operations to capture Ukrainian territory. Moving on to the next section of the front line, which is here to the west of Avdiivka, the Russians have made a wide front attack between Umanske, Semenivka and Novopokrovsk, where they are advancing here by the main road between Semenivka and Novoselivka-Persha, where they've managed to cut off the central parts of it and are moving at the same time to capture the Ukrainian fortifications here in the west of Semenivka. This is likely an attempt by the Russians to push through towards Novopokrovsk from the south, where they'll be able to gain access to the road and push in the direction of Novoselivka-Persha as well. This will likely happen with the Russians attacking from Umansk as well. This is why there is this wide front attack, as Russians are looking to gain control over the forest lines before moving up north towards Novoselivka-Persha. There's a reason why the front line spans all the way to these forest lines and not just to the villages or towns in between each other, leaving the entire open fields as a gray zone, and that is that the Ukrainians simply do have positions in every single one of these forest lines where Ukrainian soldiers are either digging trenches, holding their positions there, or moving in between the forest lines back and forth, where they are operating day and night, where they are scouting or trying to launch offensive operations against the Russians, holding back Russian assaults, etc. This is why the advances are so slow, because there's typically that many soldiers at the front line. The Russians are constantly bombarding these positions, hitting them with artillery shells, FPV drones, and so on. But this doesn't mean that they can simply just walk through. They are trying to minimize their own casualties, which means that they have to launch these massive strikes before launching assaults, where they take bit by bit to not overstretch. They can naturally push further, but that will likely cause more casualties, and that is something that they seem to be averse of doing. South of Nitailova, the Russians have advanced in a southwestern direction towards this river line here, as the Russians are looking to expand their zone of control southwest of Nitailova along it to push in a western direction and southern direction until they gain full control of the area, before they push on in a southern direction towards the Ukrainian fortifications west of Nevelsk. Moving on to the next section of the front line in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, the Russians have advanced further, capturing the eastern parts of the town, and have moved further north. This allows the Russians to gain control over the river line here to the west of Vovchansk and push the Ukrainians out to the outskirts in the northern parts of the town. This means that the town of Zaporizhzhia is close to falling. The Russian positions here have been pushed through over a portion of the month of May, where the first advances started at the very first days of May, and the latest ones happened just yesterday. And with this, we see that there are continuous developments by the Russians throughout the month of May, where they have moved to capture Zaporizhzhia bit by bit. At the same time, positional fighting is happening in the direction of Vovchansk, where the fighting is still in the southern parts. Positional fighting continues in the south, where in the direction of Robotyne, the front line is largely silent. This happens as a follow to the Russians capturing Robotyne. Securing the town has made it so that the Ukrainian positions north are all just open fields with no towns or villages available, except for Novodanilivka, that is the closest one, a few kilometers north. And with that, the Russians decided against continuing offensive operations in this section of the front line. The reason being that there is no reason to do so unless they plan on advancing in an offensive. This means that the Russians are reducing their presence in the Zaporizhzhia front to redirect their forces elsewhere to the east and to the north, where they plan on strengthening the offensive operations there. It is clear that the Russian main focus right now is in the Donetsk region and in the Kharkiv region in the north. They have also started offensive operations between Luhansk-Kharkiv border in the northeast. All of this indicates that the Russians are preparing and continuing offensive operations here, but they are limited in scale. It's likely that they will increase in intensification and operational strength as time passes by, similar to what we have seen so far. All of these offensive operations started in October with the Russian assault on Avdiivka. Following that, the Russians have captured significant territory north and west of Avdiivka, capturing half of Krasnoarivka, pushing through by Novomikhailivka, Zaporizhzhia, Marinka, Robotyne, pushing the Ukrainians out of Krinky, pushing towards Kislivka and Kotlerivka, capturing both of these villages in the north, west of Bakhmut in the direction of Chasiv Yar, in the north opening a new front. All of this happened as the Russians gradually increased the intense strength of their offensive operations, from small operations near Avdiivka to whole front operations in the Donetsk region to expanding the front in the north. And this will likely continue at a gradual rate, slowly but surely increasing their strength and intensification of their attacks to slowly speed up the process in which the Ukrainian forces are grinded down. The Ukrainians are trying to increase the mobilization, gain more aid, and so on to build up a new army to continuously fight this war. However, they will eventually run out of manpower at a much faster rate than the Russians would. And at the same time, the Russians are outproducing in weapons. So the Russians plan is simply to continue as is until the Ukrainian front collapses. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.